Have you ever woken up feeling like you were still trapped inside a nightmare? Like your body was lying in bed, but your soul was still on the battlefield? What happens inside a soldier's mind after the war is over, but the fear remains? It was just another night, or at least it should have been. The house was silent, the clock ticking just after 3 in the morning, and everything around me seemed calm. But inside my head, chaos still raged. The muffled sound of explosions, distant screams, the dry crack of gunfire echoed like memories impossible to silence. Sweat dripped down my face. The sheets were soaked. I was struggling to breathe, even though my lungs were full of air. The war wasn't over for me. It had just changed scenery. In that moment, I wasn't a father. I wasn't a husband. I wasn't even a man. I was just a body on alert, reliving everything I'd tried to bury. The bed was turning into a trench. The ceiling seemed far away, as if I were falling into my own mind. And then, in the depths of darkness, I felt something. A small hand touching my arm. A soft whisper calling, luxury. And then a hug. Firm, warm, true. A hug that didn't ask for explanations. A simple gesture that pulled me back to reality. It was at that moment that I realized that, even on the hardest nights, there was a ray of light trying to reach me. And she was only 5 years old, with sleepy eyes and a huge heart. Have you ever been through something like that? That moment when someone, without even understanding the depth of your pain, reaches out and saves you from yourself? The invisible scars of war don't show up on X-rays. They don't leave marks on the body, but they sink deep into the soul. And what few people talk about is that the real battle begins when the shooting stops, when the uniform is saved, but the triggers are still nearby. The war after the war is silent, lonely, and often cruel. But sometimes, it's in this silence that something surprising happens. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. This isn't just a story of pain. It's a journey of reconstruction, faith, and reunion. A story where love, even the simplest, has the power to break the cycle of pain. Because there are times when it's not words that save us, but gestures. And that night, I was saved by a hug. But what happened after that? Well, that's where the real story begins. That night, my daughter's hug wasn't just a gesture of affection. It was a reminder that, despite everything, I was still here, alive, present. And even though part of me was still stuck in that noisy, dark past, another part was beginning to find its way back home. Not the address, but the home inside me. It's strange how sometimes a simple touch can silence a million internal noises. Her hug didn't say, "It will pass," but it made me feel like I didn't have to face everything alone. And maybe that's what so many people need right now. A space where they can exist without being pressured to be okay all the time. Where pain isn't compared, but welcomed. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what has touched you the most so far. It could be a memory, a pain you've never been able to put into words, or just an, "I understand." What you share could be exactly what someone needs to read today to stop feeling so alone in this invisible battle. Here, each comment is like a beacon. It illuminates, welcomes, and connects. And if this content touched you in any way, don't forget to like the video. It may seem like just a click, but it shows that this message needs to continue. That stories like this have value. That giving a voice to these scars is important. Oh, and if you believe the world needs to hear more truths like this, with respect, empathy, and depth, subscribe to the channel. This is how this community grows. This is how we continue to bring stories that heal, that touch, and that make us look at others with more compassion. Your participation here is what transforms this video into something alive, vibrant, real, because we are not alone. And the more we share, the more bridges we build. And that morning, while I was still shaking inside, holding my daughter as if I were holding on to my last hope, a question began to echo inside me. The question that echoed within me was simple, yet devastating. Will I ever be able to come back in one piece? Because a part of me was already there, at home. I moved from room to room, hugged my wife, heard my daughter's laughter, watched the world go by. But inside, it was as if I was still on the march. There was no war outside, but inside me, the minefield was still full of mines. Every louder noise, every change in light, every deep silence, everything was a trigger. Invisible, but real. People looked at me like a hero. "You're back," they said. "Now it's time to start over." But no one understood that leaving the uniform in the closet didn't mean the war was over. The body was back, yes, but the soul still had to find its way, and that path had no map, no compass, no guarantee of arrival. The hardest part was realizing that time flows differently out here. The world doesn't stop to wait for your pain. The bills keep arriving. Conversations happen as if everything is fine, and you learn to smile with tired eyes, to say good morning with your heart at war, to move on even when everything inside you screams for a break. From the outside, my life seemed normal, but from the inside, the scenes told a different story. It was like watching a movie with the subtitles changed. People would say happy birthday and I would hear mission confirmed. They would say, how are you? And my mind would decipher it as, are you still a threat? This silent disconnection is exhausting. It's tiring. It's isolating. It was in this scenario that I began to realize something that no one taught me in military training. Coming back is a lonely mission. You have to relearn how to live, how to trust, how to sleep without weapons nearby, how to walk the streets without calculating escape routes, and the most challenging, how to allow yourself to feel, because for a long time, feeling was too dangerous. It was better to block it out, but by blocking out the pain, I was also blocking out everything else. Genuine joy, connecting with people, taking pleasure in simple things. And that was when a new battle began, rebuilding myself as a man, as a father, as a human being, understanding that being strong didn't mean ignoring what hurt me, but having the courage to face it head on. No medals, no audience, just me and my truth. The transformation that began with that hug from my daughter didn't come as an instant miracle. It was like a crack in the wall, small, almost imperceptible, but enough to let a little light in. And over time, I began to understand that it wasn't about forgetting what I had experienced, but about learning to carry it with dignity, without letting it define me completely. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is a hidden truth that almost no one talks about when they return from war. It is not fear that destroys them the most. It is silence. It is pretending that everything is fine. It is smiling at family gatherings while your chest is on fire. It is not having space to say, I can't sleep. I'm still there. I'm afraid to close my eyes. The truth is that the world demands a version of you that no longer exists. They expect you to go back to work, to go to the grocery store, to be present at birthdays and celebrations as if the war were a thing of the past. But what about when the war lives inside you? When the scars are invisible and therefore harder to explain? There are no stitches to be removed. There is no deadline for discharge, only daily coexistence with that which no one sees. Every morning was an exercise in decision, getting out of bed, facing the mirror, seeing a man who was surviving but not yet living, and yet continuing. Because there was a daughter there, there was a family, there was a chance to build something different with the pieces that were left, and above all, there was the desire not to spend the rest of his life surviving, but to truly live again. Many people think that those who return from war only bring stories, but most of the time what we bring are ghosts, feelings that cannot be explained, internal alerts that cannot be turned off, an exaggerated sense of responsibility, as if any distraction could be fatal, as if you were still protecting someone even in a park, even in a bakery, even at home. This is when your mindset starts to change, because you realize that there is no point in expecting the world to understand you if you still don't recognize yourself. The decision to allow yourself to feel, to open up, to seek help, is not simple, but it is revolutionary. This is when you begin to understand that true courage does not lie in the trenches, but in the willingness to heal yourself. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. I want to know who else carries marks that the world doesn't see, but that are part of their history. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because real nightmares don't always have to wait for nightfall. They appear in the middle of the day, without asking permission, disguised as simple things. Sometimes, it's just the sound of a door slamming that makes your heart race. Other times, it's a random smell, smoke from burnt food, for example, that transports you to a place you swore you had left behind. There's no warning. There's no logic. Just the impact. Quick, intense, invisible to the eyes of those around you, but devastating inside. That's why many people don't understand what it's like to live with PTSD. They think it's just about remembering what happened. But it's not about remembering. It's about reliving it. The body reacts as if it were there again. The mind goes into defense mode. And even though the environment is safe, your nervous system doesn't believe it. You're at home, but you act as if you're on a mission. You're in the shower, but your senses are alert. The sound of the water may try to calm you down, but a louder noise from outside is enough to make your whole body stiffen. It's like living like this, in a constant state of vigilance, as if the world were a minefield and you were the only one who could see the hidden dangers. It's tiring, and emotional fatigue, when it builds up, doesn't just turn into exhaustion, it turns into isolation. Because how can you explain to someone that the simple act of being in a supermarket, choosing a piece of fruit or paying a bill, can be more challenging than crossing a combat line? There is a hidden truth in all this. The emotional pain that comes after war is so silent that often the person who suffers it doesn't know how to name it. They just feel that they are no longer whole, that something broke inside them and never got back together. And so they try to adapt, try to smile, try not to bother anyone. They live on autopilot with a mask of normality. But inside, everything pulses differently. And it's not just sounds or smells that trigger these memories. Sometimes it's a gesture, a judgmental look, an innocent but misinterpreted comment. It's as if the mind has become accustomed to looking for danger, even where there is none. As if part of the brain is still stuck in that survival loop and doesn't know how to relax again. And this affects everything. Relationships become more fragile, patience diminishes, sleep disappears, trust in people wavers, because you feel like no one else understands what you carry, that everyone wants you to get over it, to let it go, to be grateful for being alive. And yes, you even try. But how can you be grateful when every dawn feels like an internal battlefield? There's something few people talk about. PTSD isn't just about pain. It's also a distorted form of survival. Your brain learned to react this way to keep you alive, and now it doesn't know how to stop. It's as if protection has become a prison, and this doesn't happen because you're weak. It happens because you've been strong for too long. Strong enough to absorb what no one should have seen. Strong enough to keep going even when you're bleeding inside. Strong enough to smile so as not to worry anyone, when all you wanted was silence and understanding. And when these triggers come, it's common for the mind to want to run away, escape from reality, distract yourself, or shut yourself off. The problem is that the more you run away, the more they catch up with you, because there's no point in covering up the sound of an alarm. It will keep ringing until you find the right chord to turn it off. And this chord, most of the time, is buried in layers of unresolved pain, of suffocated memories, of difficult decisions that still weigh on your shoulders. This journey of dealing with the post-war period is marked by revelations. You discover how much the human mind tries to protect itself at any cost. You discover that some wounds only heal when they are seen, and that it is impossible to heal what we pretend not to feel. Many people live like this, smiling in photos, functioning at work, saying that everything is fine, but inside they are screaming. And the worst part is that this scream, because it is not heard, turns into silence. And silence, if not welcomed, becomes a disease. That's why when someone says that the war is over, I think twice. Because for those who have lived it from the inside, it continues in the subtext of life. In the way we react, in the way we avoid certain places, in the way we keep quiet when the subject gets too close. But there is something powerful in this process. Awareness. When you start to notice the pattern, when you understand that the fear you feel is not madness but a learned response, everything starts to change. And this change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, care, patience. It takes courage to look inside and say, I need help. And for many soldiers, or survivors of any war, be it physical, emotional, or spiritual, this is one of the most courageous acts there is, because admitting pain is not a sign of weakness. It is the first step towards true transformation. Comment here. That makes sense to me. I want to know who also makes noises that no one hears. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what corrodes the most inside is not what was seen on the battlefield, but what is carried in silence after it is all over. There is a type of pain that has no visible wound, that does not bleed, but that weighs as if the entire body were encased in concrete. It is that feeling of being surrounded by people and yet feeling completely alone, not by choice, but because the words do not come out, and when they do, they seem insufficient. The loneliness of the post-war period is silent, but deafening. Friends who knew you before you left the military no longer know how to approach them. The jokes change, the topics seem distant, and the connection that once existed begins to slowly fade. They want to help, but they don't know how. And you, trying not to bother them, don't explain it either. It's a mutual separation, with no clear fault, just the distance that grows between worlds that now speak different languages. Inside the home, the scenario also changes. The physical presence is there, but emotionally, it's as if you're always a few steps away. The family feels it, the wife feels it, the children feel it, but no one understands exactly why. And how can you explain it? How can you say that even sitting on the couch, something inside you is still ready? That touch sometimes scares you. That love is still there, but accessing it has become more difficult. Not for lack of feeling, but because the trauma created a labyrinth where there used to be a clear path. This is the kind of thing no one teaches you when the mission is over. No one prepares you for the emotional toll of trying to reintegrate into a life that has gone on without you. No one tells you about the awkwardness of going to a family dinner and not being able to pay attention to a small conversation because your mind is too busy tracking down any unusual sounds. No one tells you about the guilt of not being able to be the same person everyone expected to see again. And the worst part is that, little by little, you start to convince yourself that it's better to keep quiet, that no one will understand, that it's easier to smile and say that everything is fine even when your heart is in ruins. This silence becomes a form of armor, heavy, rigid, but necessary, or at least that's what it seems. But this same armor, over time, becomes a prison. You protect yourself so much that you end up isolating yourself from what could still save you. The hidden truth behind this loneliness is that it doesn't form all at once. It builds up in small moments. That time you tried to speak and were interrupted. That time someone laughed at something that for you was serious. That hasty advice of "it will pass" that came from someone who had never been through it. And so, the silence grows. It becomes a habit. It becomes a shield. Many veterans suffer in silence because they learned to be strong all the time, because they cried alone in the field, in the mud, and then held back their tears, because they heard the phrase, "be a man," so many times that they started to think that feeling pain was weakness. And so when they come back, they don't know how to ask for help, how to admit that they're broken, how to show vulnerability without feeling like they're failing everyone around them. This deep-rooted mentality is one of the greatest invisible enemies that exist, because it doesn't shout, but undermines. It doesn't impose itself, but convinces. And when you realize it, you're already immersed in a loneliness that seems to have no way out. You can be in a room full of people with smiles all around and still feel like no one really sees what you're facing. And that hurts. It hurts in a way that doesn't bleed, but consumes. But there is something that needs to be said clearly. Silence does not have to be eternal. It can be broken. And when it is, even if it is with a word, a gesture, a sincere look, something begins to change. It is not always immediate, nor is it always gentle. Sometimes it hurts more at first. But it is in that space where the pain is finally named that transformation begins to become possible. There is immense value in truly listening, in having someone who simply sits next to you and says, "I'm here, even if I don't understand everything, I'm here." And sometimes, that person doesn't even need to say anything. Just being present is healing. Just looking someone in the eye without judgment breaks down barriers. Just welcoming someone without demanding explanations is healing. This journey of rediscovering your own voice, your own humanity, is slow, but every step counts. Every truth spoken, no matter how small it may seem, is a crack in that wall of silence that was built with so much effort. And through these cracks, light enters. A different light from the one that hurt you. A light that warms, that reveals, that reminds you that there is life after pain, even if it is a new life, shaped by experiences, marked by scars, but still possible. Comment here. That makes sense to me. I want to know who else has experienced the weight of this silence. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because sometimes all we need is someone who sees beyond what is being shown, not to ask questions, not to investigate, but to just be there, present, connected. It was in this space of silence, where no one else could reach, that my daughter entered. With a hug. She didn't know what I had been through. She didn't know the details of the mission. She wouldn't understand the technical words, the codes, or the fears. But she saw, not with the eyes of someone who judges or expects an explanation, but with the clear eyes of someone who loves without needing to understand. And it's curious how children carry a wisdom that adults often lose along the way. While the world asked me for performance, strength, and control, she offered me presence, touch, and acceptance. That morning, I woke up from another nightmare. I was drenched in sweat, breathing fast, my mind still on alert, even though I knew I was safe. And when I tried to compose myself, unable to control the tremors in my hands, I felt the light weight of her little body leaning against me. She didn't say anything. She just hugged me. And at that moment, something I didn't even know was still alive inside me broke. It wasn't pain. It was relief. It was as if, for a second, I could rest without protecting myself. As if that embrace, coming from such a pure place, had penetrated all the layers of armor I had built over the years. And that was when I understood. What war had hardened, love could soften. What fear had closed, tenderness could open. What the world couldn't see, she saw with a simple gesture. The truth is that there are feelings that don't need language. They speak directly to the soul. And when you're hurt in a way that you can't even explain, when everything seems too heavy, and someone touches you with such lightness, the impact is immense. That which seemed impossible to heal begins, little by little, to dissolve. Not because the pain disappears, but because it is seen, accepted, and respected. That moment became a turning point in my mindset. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel without fighting it. I allowed myself to exist without justifying it. And more than that, I allowed myself to be seen, because for so long, I was just the soldier, the role, the responsibility, the protector. But there, in my daughter's arms, I was just a father, a human being, a wounded man who, even without knowing it, still had something inside him that could be restored. This made me think about how many times we ignore the strength of the bonds that surround us. In the routine, the noise, the demands of adult life, we get used to functioning in survival mode. And in this mode, we stop listening. We stop really looking. We stop allowing the other person to reach us. But when you have someone who, even without rationally understanding what is happening, chooses to love you exactly where you are, this has the power to transform everything. My daughter, you unintentionally revealed a hidden truth. You don't always need to know what to do to help someone. Sometimes you just need to be there, and the impact of that goes beyond what we can calculate. That hug wasn't just a momentary comfort. It was the beginning of an emotional opening that I no longer believed was possible. From that moment on, I began to listen more. I began to accept moments of weakness as part of the journey. I began to realize that even with all the pain, I could still be a safe haven, and that my love as a father didn't depend on my perfection but on my real presence. This revelation shook everything inside me. Because for the first time I understood that I didn't need to have all the answers. I didn't need to be whole all the time. I didn't need to keep up the mask of strength. I just needed to be available to reconnect, to allow the love of my family to reach me, to recognize that amidst the internal rubble there was still room for reconstruction, and there began a silent, almost imperceptible but constant process. Every night, every unhurried conversation, every involuntary laugh that escaped during dinner, something inside me reorganized itself, as if the pieces, even if they didn't return to their original place, were finding a new way to fit together, a new, truer identity. Less about protection, more about presence, less about resistance, more about feeling. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. I want to know who else has been touched by a simple gesture that changed everything inside. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it was precisely there, at that moment when everything seemed too dark, that something unexpected happened. A small gesture, without fanfare, without warning. A hug. That's it. No big conversation, no long explanation. Just a firm and silent touch coming from someone who wasn't even old enough to understand the weight of what I was carrying. But it was in that gesture that everything began to change. We tend to expect great healings to be accompanied by great acts, dramatic revelations, and cinematic moments. But sometimes, what really breaks down the walls of pain is something that arrives discreetly, a look that doesn't judge, a silence that doesn't demand anything, a presence that doesn't rush. It was in this kind of space that I realized the impact that true affection can have on someone who no longer expected to be reached. What touched me that morning wasn't just my daughter's hug, it was what it represented. She didn't come to save me. She didn't come with questions or attempts to fix what I was feeling. She was just there, with her whole heart, with the innocence that doesn't know about wars but instinctively knows the value of presence. And that's when I understood. Sometimes, healing begins when someone meets you exactly where you are, without trying to force you out of there. For so long, All I did was hide, make myself functional, show strength. But that hug cut through all of that, as if to say without words, I see you, and even if you don't know how to get out of here, I'm going to stay here with you. And in that moment, something inside me allowed itself to give in. It wasn't weakness, it was space. A new space where there was no threat, no judgment, just the simple and powerful act of being embraced. It's funny how we get used to building emotional barriers. They seem essential. They protect, they shield. They create distance between the pain and the outside world. But what no one tells us is that, over time, these barriers also isolate us from everything that could restore us. They prevent love, compassion, and tenderness from entering, and we continue to think we are safe, when in fact we are alone. Alone. It was that light touch, coming from someone so small that began to crack this structure, not abruptly, but like a seed breaking through concrete, subtle, persistent, real, and that crack was all it took for the light to enter, a light different from the ones that scared me, a light that didn't invade, but invited, that didn't demand that I be better, but reminded me that I was still worthy of being loved exactly as I was. That was when a silent transformation began. I didn't wake up cured the next day. I didn't become a new person overnight, but that gesture planted something inside me, a desire perhaps, a reminder that I was more than my traumas, that there was life beyond pain, and most importantly, that I didn't have to walk this path alone. From that day on, I began to notice other details that had previously gone unnoticed. The way my wife looked at me, waiting for a sign. The patient silence of my parents who didn't know what to say but were always there. The friends who insisted on meeting me for coffee, even though I refused 9 times before accepting the 10th. And I began to realize that the world around me wasn't as distant as it seemed. I was the one who had distanced myself, and that was okay. I needed that time, but I also needed to recognize that love, even if silent, was still waiting for me at my doorstep. This was one of the greatest revelations of my journey. True healing does not begin with big decisions. It begins with the small, with the details, with presence. It begins when someone, even without knowing how, decides not to leave. When someone chooses to be, even without understanding, even without having the right words. Because deep down, it is not the words that heal. It is the intention. It is the space that opens up when the other person realizes that they can simply exist, without fear of being a burden, without fear of being too much. And when this awareness sets in, everything around you begins to take on a new shape. Not because the pain has disappeared, but because you begin to see that it no longer needs to be hidden, that it is possible to live with it, learn from it, transform what was once a wall into a bridge, and little by little you find yourself opening the door to what once seemed impossible. Trust. The trust that it is possible to be accepted, that you don't need to be whole to be loved, that yes, there is still room to start over. Comment here. That makes sense to me. I want to know who has experienced this kind of silent healing, this affection that arrives without noise but changes everything. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because as much as the silent affection of that night planted a seed within me, there was a turning point in this journey, a moment when facing the truth stopped being an emotional choice and became a necessity for survival. And I'm not talking about that survival linked to the war instinct, the reaction to stay alive at any cost. I'm talking about the survival of the soul, of sustaining something inside that was still human, sensitive, whole, of rescuing a version of myself that I had almost let die. This moment was not heroic. There was no background music or emotional scene. It was solitary, silent, and deeply honest. I was in my car, parked a few meters from home. I had just returned from the market after a silent crisis in the frozen food aisle, when the smell of a cleaning product sent me straight to a field hospital. My body reacted immediately. Cold sweat, racing heart, shallow breathing. It didn't even last a minute, but it was enough to break me down. There, with my forehead resting on the steering wheel, I felt the weight of it all, of all the days of pretending to be normal, of all the forced smiles, of all the nights I woke up afraid of screaming and scaring my family. And for the first time in a low voice, almost a whisper, I said, I can't do this alone anymore. And just saying it, something changed. That was the turning point, the silent courage to admit that even though I was trained to resist, to endure, to protect, I needed to be protected too. That asking for help was not a failure. It was maturity. It was respect for my own existence. And more than that, it was an act of love. Love for my daughter, for my wife, for myself. Seeking help wasn't easy. Every step was an internal challenge. From the first connection to the first consultation, the fear of being misunderstood, the shame of appearing vulnerable, the insecurity of being judged. All of this was present. But with each new step, I realized that these fears were more connected to the image I was trying to maintain than to reality. And it was at this point that I began to understand the depth of the word transformation. Because true transformation doesn't happen when you change on the outside. It starts when you allow yourself to be touched on the inside. When you make room for the discomfort of looking at yourself without filters, without excuses, without masks. When you decide to abandon the character you created to survive and start rebuilding the person you want to be to live. Psychological counseling was one of the greatest gifts I allowed myself to receive, not because it brought ready-made answers, but because it taught me to ask better questions, understanding my triggers, naming my emotions, noticing patterns that I repeated without realizing it, and most importantly, accepting that scars were not a problem, but part of my history that I could learn to honor. Therapy is not a miracle. It doesn't erase the past, but it can reorganize. It creates a safe space where you can exist whole without having to be okay all the time, where you can fail without being condemned, cry without being seen as weak, feel without being interrupted. And it was within this space that I began to find something that had long seemed lost. Relief. Not the kind of relief that comes from running away from pain, but the kind that comes when you finally face it head on. In addition to therapy, I found support in groups with other veterans. Men and women who, like me, were trying to find themselves again after being torn apart by the experience of war. And there, between stories that crossed in silence and looks that understood without needing an explanation, I realized that I was not alone, that what seemed like my greatest flaw, this persistent pain that no one saw, was, in fact, an invisible link with so many people who were also trying to rebuild themselves. And in the midst of all this, faith began to occupy a new space in my life. Not as a crutch, but as a ground, a solid ground where I could rest my mind, my heart, my body, the faith that told me that even broken, I was still valuable, that even confused, I could still be guided, that even hurt, I could still love and be loved. And it was this faith that gave me strength when everything seemed uncertain, that kept me going when fear tried to paralyze me. This decision to seek help was not a radical change. It was a daily choice, a commitment to myself. To respect the time of the process, to not rush to look good, to not skip steps just to please others, but also to not give up halfway, to continue listening to myself, to continue rebuilding myself, to continue allowing myself to feel. And when I look back at that man leaning against the steering wheel, broken inside and not knowing what to do, I don't see weakness. I see courage. The courage to stop lying to yourself, to face the pain head on, to say enough to the silence that consumes you, to open the door, even if you're afraid, to everything that could one day become a cure. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. I want to know who else has experienced this moment of quiet courage and decided to start, even without knowing what the path would be like. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because once you make the decision to seek help, you begin a journey that few truly understand. The healing process is not linear. It is not clean, nor is it simple. There is no straight line between trauma and overcoming it. What there is, in fact, is a path full of curves, setbacks, moments of relief, and others of collapse. And all of this is part of it. At first, I thought that simply acknowledging the pain would make it go away. But I soon realized that acknowledging it is just the first step. From there, you need to learn to live with it differently. You need to look it in the eye, understand where it comes from, what it wants to tell you, and most importantly, what you are going to do with all of this. The pain is still there, but it starts to change places. It goes from being something that dominates you to something that teaches you. There were nights when I thought I was regressing, dreams so vivid that they left me paralyzed even after waking up. Everyday situations that I thought I knew how to deal with, but that surprised me with hidden triggers. And each time this happened, an internal voice tried to convince me that nothing had changed, that I was stagnant. But over time I realized a hidden truth. Each time the pain appeared and I remained, something inside me grew stronger. Remaining is a form of resistance. of not giving in, of carrying on despite the weight. My daughter continued to be my point of reference, not because she understood what was going on with me, but because her love was constant. She didn't mince words. She didn't demand anything from me. She simply loved me as I was, with all my absences, my silences, my limits, and those hugs from her, sometimes out of the blue, in the middle of any given Sunday, served as a reminder that I was still here. I was still needed. I was still loved, even with everything. And this was shaping a new mindset within me. Little by little, I began to accept that I didn't have to win the whole war at once, that every nightmare I faced was a battle won, that every morning I was able to get out of bed, make coffee, and listen to my wife talk about her day, even though my mind was tired. It was a small miracle, because before, I was just surviving. Now, even in pain, I was starting to live again. The therapy sessions continued. The support group meetings became a safe place, and it was in this space that I realized how much beauty there was in shared vulnerability. Men who, like me, had been taught never to show weakness, now talked about fear, loneliness, regrets, faith, hope. There was no judgment. There was listening, and that listening healed me as much as the words, because being truly heard is a rare thing. And when you allow yourself to be heard without having to defend yourself, something profound happens. You reconcile with yourself. The pain gradually took on new colors, not because it disappeared, but because I stopped fighting it all the time. I began to understand that instead of trying to expel it from my life, I could invite it to sit with me, listen to it, learn, recognize myself in the parts it touched. This did not make me weaker, quite the opposite. It was at this point that I began to see that pain, when embraced, becomes a tool. It stops being an open wound and becomes a scar, and every scar tells a story. And even on the days when everything seemed to come back, the fear, the butterflies in my stomach, the feeling of being in the wrong place, I remembered how far I had come, how much I had faced, and that changed everything. Because when you look back and see how much you have endured, you realize that you don't need to be perfect to keep going. You just need to be constant, faithful to this new process, willing to not give up on yourself. Faith remained part of that foundation, not as an explanation for what happened, but as a presence that accompanied me, even on days when I couldn't pray. Sometimes faith was just the attire of taking a deep breath and trying again. It was the ability to trust that, even without understanding why, there was something greater sustaining me, something that didn't demand results from me, but offered me comfort, something that reminded me that my story was still being written. With each small milestone, I allowed myself to celebrate. The first month of sleeping without waking up in a cold sweat. The first birthday I could smile without guilt. The first day I heard my daughter say, "Daddy, you look different," and knew deep down that it was true. These moments didn't come with fireworks, but each one was a milestone, a turning point, a reminder that the pain hadn't won. Sure, there were still setbacks, moments of doubt, days of heavier silence, but now I had tools. I had names. I had a story. And that made a difference, because what had once been an endless raging sea was now a river with banks, a path, a flow that sometimes grew stronger but that no longer carried me away, because I had anchors, and the greatest of them was the love that surrounded me, even when I couldn't perceive it. Comment here. That makes sense to me. I want to know who else is walking this path where the pain doesn't suddenly disappear, but it no longer has the last word. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there comes a time when you look back and realize that everything that once seemed like the end was actually the beginning of a new mission. What was once an open wound has become a path. What was once a burden has become a purpose. And almost without realizing it, you stop being just a survivor of your story and become someone who can guide others through the shadows that you once knew so well. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It comes like the tide, silent, persistent, constant. At a certain point in my journey, I stopped asking myself, why did this happen to me? And started asking myself, what can I do with everything I've experienced? This change in mindset doesn't erase the past, but it gives it new meaning. Because when you understand that your suffering can be a bridge to alleviate the suffering of others, something inside you aligns itself in a different way. It was by hearing stories similar to mine, by seeing in the eyes of others the same pain that I carried in silence, that I began to speak out. Not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone who knew what it was like to walk with a heavy heart, I didn't want to be a master of anything, but I knew what it was like to feel broken inside, and that gave me the authority to welcome. It made me useful, not because I was healed, but because I was willing to keep walking even with the scars showing. And that's how the pain stopped being just mine. It became language. It became empathy. It became shelter for those who were still in the dark. I started sharing my story in conversation circles, meetings with veterans, and small talks in support groups. At first, my voice would shake. My hands would sweat. But after each talk, someone would come up to me with tears in their eyes and say, "You told my story." And that changed everything. It was the kind of connection that goes beyond what is said. It was recognition, identification, truth. It was a reunion with the meaning that I had lost for so long. The hidden truth is that often, we wait too long to feel ready. We wait to heal completely. We wait to stop hurting. We wait to be strong all the time. But no one needs to be whole to be useful. No one needs to have all the answers to welcome someone. Sometimes just being there saying, "I understand," is transformative. It paves the way. It sustains. That's when I realized that I hadn't just come back from war with wounds. I also brought something precious: sensitivity, the ability to see beyond appearances, to perceive in the eyes of others what they haven't yet had the courage to say, to feel in the tone of their voice the sadness they hide behind their "everything's fine." This fine perception is not a weakness, it's a tool, it's a gift. And it only exists because I walked through dark places that forced me to listen with my heart. And this kind of listening, when put into practice, is transformative. It builds trust. It creates bonds. It breaks down walls. And the more I listened, the more I understood that the battles I faced didn't make me smaller. They made me deeper, more human, more attentive. It was because of them that I began to help others not get lost in their own shadows, to recognize their own limits, to accept that feeling pain is not a sign of weakness, but of life. Today, my mission is not about forgetting what I experienced. It is about using what I experienced to remind others that they are not alone, that there is a way out, that even in the darkest of nights, there can still be light, and that no matter how dark it may seem now, the dawn always comes, even if it is slow, even if it is silent, even if you need someone to remind you of it when you forget. And this led me to a type of surrender that I never imagined I would experience. The surrender of someone who knows that their difficult past can be a relief for someone else's pain. This new mission is not about being anyone's savior. It's about walking together, about reaching out without promising shortcuts, about saying, "I'm still in the process, but I can already hear you." It's about not rushing, about not imposing solutions. It's about offering presence, because sometimes all someone needs is to know that there is another human being on this side of the pain, willing to stay, to listen, to support. And this attitude, so simple and so human, is what begins silent and profound healings. And in this new stage of my journey, I have learned to look at myself with more kindness. I no longer demand that the pain disappear completely. I only demand the courage to continue building a new meaning from what seemed like nothing but ruin. And with each story I hear, with each person who meets me on this path and says, "I thought I was the only one who felt this way," I remember the reason for all of this. It's not about me, it's about us. That "we" has become the driving force behind everything I do today. Because when you understand the impact of your story, not as a burden but as a bridge, you stop hiding. You start standing up, not as someone superior, but as someone present, someone real, someone who bleeds, but who heals, someone who fails, but who walks, someone who remembers the pain, but chooses to use that memory as a boost, not a prison. And perhaps this is one of the greatest revelations of this entire journey, realizing that our pain can be transformed into direction, that our losses can be seeds, that what once paralyzed us can be exactly what moves us now, not to pretend it didn't hurt, but to show that it is possible to continue, even when it still hurts. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. I want to know who else understood that after surviving there is something even greater, living with purpose and helping others do the same. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because behind every silence, there is often a story that never found a safe place to be told. And it is precisely this space of listening, of acceptance, of presence without judgment, that can become the turning point in someone's life. Sometimes what transforms is not what is said, it is what we allow ourselves to feel together. Because pain, when acknowledged, becomes less heavy. When someone looks at you and says, "I don't know what you went through, but I'm here," something inside us begins to reorganize itself. For a long time, I believed that my scars separated me from others, that they were a kind of defect, a flaw along the way, something to be hidden. But today, with a calmer heart and less defensive eyes, I understand that they are exactly what bring me closer to those who also fight to continue. Scars tell where we were hurt, yes, but they also show where we were strong enough not to give up. They are like maps of survival. And when we meet another human being who also carries their maps in their body or soul, the path no longer seems so lonely. The beauty of this type of connection is that it doesn't require masks. On the contrary, it only happens when we have the courage to take off our armor, to show the cracks, to be honest. And it is in this place where there is no longer any obligation to pretend to be strong that true strength is born, the kind that comes from vulnerability, from complete presence, from the truth that liberates, because there is nothing more powerful than a real encounter between two hearts that have already bled and yet continue to beat. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about this whole process is realizing that, in the midst of pain, it is still possible to find beauty, a raw, real, unadorned beauty, the beauty of being able to take a deep breath after a difficult day, of being able to sleep a little better after weeks of not sleeping, of being able to laugh again at a silly joke, of feeling the warmth of a hug and not withdrawing, of starting to trust even when afraid. All of this is a sign that life is starting to pulse again, even if slowly, and it is okay to be slow. Healing is not in a hurry. It moves at the pace of truth. When I say that you are not alone, it is not just a catchphrase. It is because I know firsthand what it is like to think that no one understands. I know what it is like to look around and feel that everyone is living, while you are just trying to cope. And I also know how tiring it is to hold everything inside, how much your body feels, how much your heart closes. But the truth is that there are many people carrying invisible battles. People who seem strong on the outside, but inside just want an honest hug, a leisurely look, a place to exist without having to explain so much. And that's why this conversation here is important, because maybe, today, you don't have the strength to tell your story to anyone. Maybe you can't even organize everything you feel. But just hearing another story that reminds you of yours, something inside you starts to move, and this movement is sacred. It's the body saying, "I want to live too." It's the soul saying, "I'm still here." And little by little, you find yourself breathing differently, walking differently, trusting a little more, allowing yourself, for the first time in a long time, to be taken care of. Healing, contrary to what they say, does not happen when everything goes back to the way it was before. It happens when we decide to move on, even knowing that some parts will never be the same again. It happens when we choose to live with dignity, even with our flaws, even with our pain. And more than that, when we decide to be a shelter for others, even when we are undergoing internal transformation. This is the great transformation, when pain stops defining us and starts teaching us, when we understand that we can be a point of support, even when our knees are still shaky. If you've made it this far, if anything in all of this made sense to you, it's because your story matters. Your pain is not an exaggeration. Your struggle is not invisible. And what you feel, no matter how messy it may seem, has value. There is healing, yes, but it doesn't start in books or ready-made advice. Often it starts with the simplest gesture, a hug, a real conversation, a space where someone says, "I'm with you, even if I don't understand everything." Because at the end of the day, no one needs to understand everything. All you need is to be willing to not leave. This video is not about me. It's about what can happen when we decide not to hide anymore. When we find the courage to say, "I'm on this journey too." Because every story told with truth paves the way for other stories to come out of hiding. And every word spoken from the heart can be exactly what someone else needed to hear to keep going. That's how we find ourselves. Between the lines, in the pauses, in the memories that still hurt, but no longer paralyze us. We find ourselves in shared vulnerability, and that's where life begins again. Comment here. I'm on that journey too. I want to read your voice, your story, your feelings, because even if we don't know each other, we already have something in common. We decided not to carry all this alone. If you've made it this far, truly, thank you. It means that this conversation touched something deep inside you, and perhaps just like me, you're also on this path of silent reconstruction. Step by step, day by day. And that's why this space exists. to remind us that we don't have to go through all of this alone. If this content made sense to you, if at any point you felt welcomed, leave a like, not because it helps the video, but because it shows that this message needs to continue to resonate, that it is worth creating this type of encounter. And if you can, write in the comments, "I'm with you until the end." That way I'll know you've stayed here, breathing every word with me. And if this kind of conversation is good for you, if you want to continue walking with me through topics that truly touch the soul, subscribe to the channel. Every week there are more stories like this, more reflections, more possible paths for those who carry the invisible and choose to follow it anyway. There is a video here that complements this subject and can help you see this journey with different eyes. Click and stay with me there. We still have a lot to talk about.